I began life as a priest in Hereford diocese in the late 1960s, and in those days there was no shortage in that diocese of eccentric clergy. Okay, none. And one of them was a lovely man called Claude Sell, who the minute I was ordained would come up to me and always say, "Oh, good morning, brother." He always called me brother, which was very, touching really. And he was well known, became sadly infamous for not remembering when he was taking a wedding, whether it was a funeral or a wedding. And he used to walk in front of the bride saying the sentences from the funeral service. "I am the resurrection and the life," said Claude. And there's a girl coming behind with a bouquet. But he was just one. There was another who was a lovely, lovely white-haired old priest who lived in a vast, absolutely huge vicarage quite close to the River Wye, near Ross. And I came across him for the very first time at a clergy conference. And in clergy conferences, there are often sort of people there selling clergy clothes, dog collars and all that, cassocks and all that sort of stuff. So I was queuing up as a brand new, very kind of blingy curate, trying to make sense of what it meant to wear a dog collar. And I queued up behind this man, and he was wearing a black cassock which was literally green with mildew and age. Oh, poor old thing. He was stumbling forward, got as far as the sales rep and said to them, "How much would a new cassock be?" And they told him the price. And I can see him now wandering away disconsolate because he felt it was too much to pay. Now he was sadly well known because in his vicarage, if you went there, the kitchen was absolutely packed on shelves, on the fridge, on the table, everywhere there were little bottles. And little bottles were not alcohol, they were bottles filled with water, HP sauce bottles, etc., etc., etc. And somebody once said to him, why are you keeping all these bottles? He said, "You never know, if there's an atomic war, I shall survive." Reminds me of a time when I was a vicar of the Bourne in Farnham, and I had a wonderful phone call one day from a retired brigadier. "Vicar." "Yes, brigadier." You're having a bottle store?" "Yes, yeah." "At the fete?" "Yes." "I've got some bottles for you." I thought, "It's very, very kind, brigadier. I'll come round and pick them up." So I went round to see him in my car, and he handed me a cardboard box full of empty HP sauce bottles, empty salad cream bottles. So I don't know what he thought I was collecting them for, but I took them to the dump and thanked him very, very generously. He's a wonderful man, wonderful man. Now, whether you consider that, those two first vicars I've mentioned, either eccentric or sad, I don't know. But I find it slightly kind of piquant, really, to think of that very elderly, old priest in his vicarage, waiting for a kind of atomic apocalypse, but surrounded with these little bottles of water. And it reminds me of the title of a book. A friend of mine, actually I can name him exactly, it was Geoffrey Curtis, who used to be vicar of Braithwaite. He'd seen in an Arundel bookshop a book written by a vicar, not in Guildford Diocese, I hasten to add, it was in Arundel at the time, and the title was wonderful. It said, 25 Years of Hell in a Country Parish. And there was another priest I once knew on the Welsh borders who was very, very eccentric. He was fascinated by the relationship between mathematics and prayer. Don't know what it was, but he was fascinated by the possibility of some kind of relationship. But he was also wanted to be a kind of evangelist, and he thought up a great idea for this. He had his arms, which were very muscular, he was always digging his garden and all of that, had his arms tattooed with biblical verses. So you would have, my brother Esau is a hairy man, but I am a smooth man, or whatever, tattooed down his arms. And then he'd go to local agricultural shows, strip off, and do the kind of ripple the biblical texts up and down his arm, which makes, I think, the Road to Damascus story about St. Paul very tame. And then there was another friend of mine, alas now dead, in a neighbouring diocese to Hereford, who was a bachelor and had become very lonely and decided that this was in the days long before the internet, that he would cheer his life up by putting an advert in the Lonely Hearts column of his local newspaper. So he did that, lonely vicar looking for a warm companion, or phrase something like that. Well, he was so overwhelmed with applicants, he literally had to do a runner, had to run away for a couple of weeks to let all the fuss die down. He was at one stage a chaplain to the Bishop of Worcester, a man called Mervyn Charles Edwards, and Mrs. Charles Edwards was never short of small talk. She could talk with anybody about anything, a lovely person. And one day they'd invited R.S. Thomas, the Welsh poet, to come and give an address to the clergy of Worcester Diocese in Hartlebury Castle. So Mrs. Charles Edwards was deputed to talk to this notoriously reclusive priest and said to him, "So, Mr. Thomas, did you have a good journey? Which way did you come?" And he just said, "The shortest way." And that was all he said. And poor Mrs. Charles Edwards was left flummoxed by that. Then there was a canon of Winchester in the 19th century who suffered from the delusion that his nose was going to drop off. Okay. So he stuck black sticking plaster in stripes to hold his nose to his cheeks. And the local people said that he looked more like a tiger than a clergyman, which was nice. And there was another 19th century canon of Worcester Cathedral who always dressed extremely untidily. And he wore an extremely long, heavily starched surplice, an immense black scarf tied at the neck with tape. His preaching bands were always askew, and to finish off his clerical costume, he wore long, ill-fitting black gloves, which when he preached, because they were far too long for his hands, flapped up and down in the cathedral breeze. Probably the most famous early 19th century eccentric clergyman was the Dean of Westminster, a man called William Buckland. He was extremely fond of geology. In fact, he was one of the foremost experts in the field and was a fellow of the Royal Society, so he was no intellectual slouch. But in the deanery in Westminster, he kept an incredible menagerie. He had snakes, he had eagles, he had monkeys, and he set himself the task, I can't believe this, but he did, he set himself the task of eating as many varieties of animals as he could, just to see what they tasted like. And on one very famous occasion, he was dining at the home of Lord Harcourt, and during the dinner he was given to look at something that he thought was a geological specimen, like a piece of pumice. So he put it in his mouth to test its texture, and then inadvertently swallowed it. Whereupon Lord Harcourt told him that actually he'd just swallowed part of the mummified heart of King Louis XIV. Of all the living things that he ate in his time, he claimed the most unpleasant things to taste were moles and blue bottle flies. God, horrible, isn't it? Can you imagine it? Well, Cornwall's had its fair share of eccentric clergy. The Reverend F.W. Densham, he was apparently very, very quarrelsome and kept picking fights with his parishioners. And the final straw for them came when he painted the interior of his ancient church with alternating red and blue stripes. And that was it as far as the congregation were concerned. They deserted him. They just couldn't put up with his quarrelsomeness and his craziness anymore. So because they didn't come to church, he made some cardboard cutouts of each of his parishioners, propped them up in the pews, and then preached at them. Or there was Father Pat Shaw of York, who was asked by the Archbishop of York's office if he would please supply the ages of his confirmation candidates, which is what we all have to do when we take confirmation services. And he was so annoyed by the Archbishop asking for the ages of his candidates that he added to each name their height and weight and girth, saying that he thought that had as much relevance to the administration of confirmation as their ages. And then there was Father Bruce Cornford, who was a bit of a stormy petrel, because when he was a curate in Southampton, he was so angered by his vicar's long and frequent holidays that he put the vicarage up for sale whilst the vicar was away. So if you go down the street and look in Clark Gammon Wellers, you'll see there's a nice rectory for sale. No, you won't at all. So the vicar returned and gave him the sack. And two more eccentrics. Again, a Cornishman, the Reverend Robert Hawker of Morwenstow in Cornwall, who was so bored by his parishioners recounting to him tales of strange sea creatures that he rowed himself out one night from Bude, draped himself with seaweed, and made from seaweed a tail and a wig, and camouflaged himself as a mermaid, and then sang haunting songs to the throng who gathered around. Well, so many people came to see him, he was very surprised and really rather embarrassed about it, that one night as his grand finale, he ended up by singing God Save the King, and then slipped below the waves and waited for everyone to go home. It's just amazing, isn't it? To think he might do that. And there's a haunting tale, what I find very sad. Sabine Baring Gould, who was the author of, amongst other things, Onward Christian Soldiers, he had fathered 15 children. And at the birthday party of one of his daughters, he spotted a child in the crowd that he didn't recognize. So he went up to this little girl and said, "And whose little girl are you?" And she burst into tears and through her sobs said, "Yours, Daddy." Oh, can you imagine? And finally, I suppose, the most famous and infamous was the very odd vicar of, no, I'm going to mispronounce this. Anybody here from Norfolk?
It's from Stiffkey.
Stiffkey. Is it Stookie or Stiffkey?
Well, sometimes it's pronounced Stiffkey as well.
Right, okay. Well, either will do, will it? Okay. In that case, he was the rector of both Stiffkey and Stookie. Okay. A man called Harold Davidson. He'd taken the liberty of setting up a mission to fallen women in London. And he was so frequently absent from his parish that a case was brought against him for immoral behaviour. And in the 1930s, it was a cause célèbre. Well, he was eventually tried and defrocked, but he'd run up such huge legal bills trying to defend himself that he had to revert to his occupation before ordination. he'd worked as a showman. So he got himself a job in a sideshow on Blackpool Prom. Eventually he was part of a circus act in Skegness, and there he was severely mauled by a lion called Freddie, and he died some days later in hospital because the doctor wrongly diagnosed him as being diabetic and gave him too much insulin, and he wasn't diabetic at all, and he died. Now, whether Harold Davidson was eccentric or foolish or wrong-headed, who is to know? Ian Wilson describes him as a tragic buffoon. But it illustrates, I suppose, that the Church of England, of which I'm a member and a very proud member, has for the most part been able to cope with eccentric clergy. But when I look back on all those men, I have to say that I'm left with feelings of sadness really about them. I don't think they deserved censure. They might have been in desperate need of pastoral care, which they don't seem to have received. But let me now go on. Because you may remember in the 1960s there was a sitcom called All Gas and Gaiters, starring Derek Nimmo as the bishop's chaplain and Robertson Hare as the archdeacon. I used to think it was grim then, and I had another look at it a few months ago, and I thought it was even worse second time round. And the only reason I mention it is it was filmed, some of it, in the house and gardens of the house I lived in when I was Bishop of St Albans. So those are some of my eccentric clergy, but I want now to link them into another part of the kind of slightly eccentric genre. And this is eccentric clergy as detectives. And here the eccentricity is used by various authors to point out that figures of fun, though clergy might be, perhaps there's something about our training which leads us to have much in common with amateur detectives. It may be something to do with individuality, maybe something to do with experience of human nature, maybe something to do with our innocent foolishness, which might perhaps camouflage insight. And that same capacity for being slightly outside society at an oblique angle. And I just want to refer back to Sunday night service, because what we were doing there was to commemorate an astonishing man, the second rector of Haslemere, George Herbert Aitken. What that man achieved in Haslemere in a very brief period of time was astonishing. He'd worked in Whitechapel with Samuel and Henrietta Barnett. Henrietta is now regarded as a bit of a saint in the church for all she did for prostitutes and women who'd hit hard times. Well, he trained under that man, came to Haslemere, and within 3 years had raised enough money to create a church school for 349 children. He set up almshouses and hospitals, and you name it, he did it. Perhaps not hospitals, but what we would call community nursing services. An amazing man. And Justin Manley Cooper, who gave the address at that service, gave it the full works, really. It was just remarkable that in this small town, which then I think, Hamish, was about 1,400 people or thereabouts, this man was transformative. No doubt he annoyed people a bit, because all clergy annoy people a bit, by definition. But he achieved fantastically. Let me go back to my detectives. I suppose the doyen of all clergy detectives, and an eccentric is Father Brown. He was the Roman Catholic priest who was the creation of G.K. Chesterton. He appeared in over 50 short stories between 1910 and 1936. And Chesterton explained that it was through the voice of Father Brown, it was Father Brown's understanding of potential and real evil. And he'd come to that understanding through hearing confessions. Now, how did Father Brown come into the author's mind? Well, in 1903, he was walking across the moors from Keighley to Ilkley in the company of a Catholic priest, a man called Father O'Connor. And during that walk, without breaking any confidences, the priest told Chesterton about some of the evil and perverted practices that he'd come across in his ministry. Now, Chesterton was a bit of a kind of bumbling innocent, and he couldn't believe what he was hearing. And I quote, "It was a curious experience to find that this quiet and pleasant celibate had plumbed those abysses far deeper than I. I'd not imagined the world could hold such horrors." So then Chesterton, having finished their walk, they go back to a house where they were staying, and there were two Cambridge undergraduates standing by the fire. Father O'Connor left the room, and they made some fatuous remark about a celibate priest being completely unable to understand the way the world is. And Chesterton realized that they couldn't be further from the truth, that his creation, Father Brown, was a pudding-faced priest with eyes, I quote, "as empty as the North Sea," carried an umbrella, and lumpy parcels wrapped up in brown paper. But in the introduction to the complete Father Brown stories, this quotation is found. "It is Father Brown's engaging insignificance that is part of the enigma surrounding his character and his appeal. As a detective, he relies on intuition, psychological insight, and an extraordinary knowledge of philosophy and moral teaching." Let me just return for the moment to Father O'Connor, who gave G.K. Chesterton the idea for creating a Father Brown as a detective. Because there's nothing, honestly, there is nothing about human beings that shocks me, having been a priest for over 50 years, but plenty of things about we human beings that troubles and disturbs me. When I was a vicar, it wasn't so bad when I was a bishop, but as a vicar I used to get quite tired at drinks parties when somebody who usually had one gin too many would come up to me and explain that as a vicar I couldn't possibly know anything about real life. So I let this ride for a year or two, and I've had enough of this. So the next time it happened, I said to my interlocutor, "No, of course I've had no experience of real life. By the way, have you had any experience of sitting for hours with people who are about to commit suicide?" And there'd be silence. "Have you visited murderers in prison?" Silence. "Have you had people turn up on your doorstep who'd been beaten to a pulp by an angry husband?" Silence. "Does your phone go off in the middle of the night and it's somebody wanting to tell you they've got the razor blades ready and are about to self-harm?" Is that your experience? At which point they would have another gulp of their gin and tonic and graciously admit that none of those things had ever happened to them. I know there are other priests in this audience, but I assure you all of those things that I've said are absolutely true of me and absolutely true of any good priest. I recall going as a bishop to Broadmoor. I was asked if I would go, and because I was in charge of all hospital chaplains throughout the country, would I go and spend time in Broadmoor? It was one of the most demanding things I've ever had to do, because by definition, if you're a prisoner in Broadmoor, you're in there because you've committed the most horrendous crimes. And I found myself unable to use the normal entrees into social conversation. I couldn't say, how long are you in for? I couldn't say, where did you come from? I couldn't ask what they'd done to get themselves in there. All the normal bits that you might use in other prisons didn't work. And then at the end of that visit, I was taken to the woodwork shop. And there were two men standing who, as I say, by definition, must have committed the most horrendous crimes. And they had in their hands a wooden bowl that they'd turned, a potpourri bowl. And they'd made one for the Queen, and they made one for me. And I choked, because this was, a carpenter shop which had obviously echoes and resonances. And these were men who had done terrible things, and yet could still bring themselves to give something to a visitor. So my belief is that, we may be an eccentric lot, but actually there's nothing we haven't seen and nowhere we haven't been one way or another. Well, that's a bit serious, so let's go on a bit. Father Brown says of his work as a detective, quotes, "I try to get inside a man. I am inside the man, thinking his thoughts, wrestling with his passions, and when I feel like the murderer, then I know who he is." Well, Chesterton was quite witty as well as writing quite significant stuff. And he describes a journey by a bus through North London. I quote, "It was one of those journeys on which a man perpetually feels that now at last he must have come to the end of the universe, and then finds he's only come to the beginnings of Tufnell Park." And there's another little gem. He's writing about exclusive hotels. The menu, he writes, quotes, "was written in the sort of super French employed by cooks, but quite unintelligible to Frenchmen." Now, one of the characteristics of Chesterton's writing about Father Brown is his use of paradox. This is the simple, apparently simple celibate who can outwit the most intelligent. Some of the characters in the stories are also creatures of paradox. I quote about Julius K. Brain, a very large and wealthy American who, wrote Chesterton, had this great quality which very few of us can claim, that his presence was as big as his absence. Now, Father Brown is a delight. It's a bit dated these days. He is a delight. However, I don't think any longer any author is likely to create a priest character with the innocence of Father Brown anymore. Because after all the terrible paedophile cases in both the Church of England and the Catholic Church, innocence is no longer seen as a characteristic of a priest. And it's a terrible burden for those of us who are priests to carry. I have been shouted at in the street. I've been spat at in the street when I've been wearing my dog collar for being associated with a church which has paedophiles as part of its membership. It's not pleasant at all to have to suffer that kind of abuse. And I've travelled on tubes with Catholic priests who, before they get on the tube, take their dog collar out, a little tunnel dog collar. And I was with one who did that. I said, "Why have you done that?" He said, "I just daren't wear it anymore. I've had so much abuse for being a priest. People don't trust us anymore, so I prefer to travel anonymously. Let me go on to a more Anglican and entirely different detector. Let me just check. How long am I going on for, Hamish?
You're doing very well.
Am I good? Good. That's good to know. How long do you want? When do you want me to stop?
Stop in about a quarter of an hour and then have questions.
Okay. Quarter of an hour it is. Have you heard the one about there was no? Sorry, I won't do that. Right. So I'm going to go to another entirely different detective. This time a woman, a deaconess, Theodora Braithwaite. Now, Theodora Braithwaite, you may not have come across, but she was the creation of D.M. Greenwood. Now, D.M. Greenwood was a former teacher of classics. Then she became an ecclesiastical civil servant and retired from her final post as Diocesan Director of Education for Rochester Diocese in 2004. I think I've got one of her books here. Here it is. It's called Mortal Spoils. She very kindly gave me that in 1998. Well, her heroine is found in novels that were produced between 1991 and 1999. And this one centres on the underlying machinations of what Greenwood calls Ecclesia Place. It's a not very thinly disguised amalgam of Church House, Westminster, and Number 1 Millbank, which used to be the headquarters of the Church Commissioners. So the plot in this book is actually fairly simple. There is to be an important ecumenical meeting at Ecclesia Place between the Archbishop of Canterbury and his advisors, including the Chief Executive of Church House, the aptly named Canon Clutch, and the Orthodox Archimandrite of an obscure Transylvanian country called Asbarnahi. Okay, so that's the setting. And a young and delightful civil servant called Tom Logg is in the early days of his life as a junior civil servant in Ecclesia Place, and is determined to bring to it some of the insights he's learned about management techniques from his degree at the University of Reading. He's done nothing except be a student, but he's already a management consultant, along with lots of others, and I never understand that. If you've done nothing, haven't run a business, well, there we are. So all is going quite smoothly in his life until, in one of his explorations of the architectural complexity of Ecclesia Place, and only a short while before the signing of a high-powered covenant between the Church of England and the Orthodox Church of Asbarnahi, he stumbles across a bishop seated in a chair. Nothing odd about that until he looks closely and discovers actually the bishop is dead. So he panics, Tom panics. He drags the dead bishop into another room, finds a rug in which he wraps the corpse, and a few minutes later the Archbishop of Canterbury arrives and, to Tom's horror, enters the room called the Turnbull Room. Presumably that's a dig at the then Bishop of Rochester, Michael Turnbull, where the corpse is hidden. Tom is present when the Archbishop spots the rug, recognizes it as a very unusual piece, pulls it open, and to Tom's amazement, doesn't find a corpse hidden within it. So who was the dead bishop? Who disturbed the body and took it away? Why? What is Tom to do? There's a covenant about to be signed. The press are turning up. What will happen next? Now, Tom has heard of a 30-year-old deaconess, Theodora Braithwaite, who lives just across the Thames, and he turns to her for help. And in this book, there are some lovely, lovely one-liners, like this definition of cathedral deans. I quote, "They run cathedrals, sometimes they're scholars, but most of the time they're only pretending." Ooh. Or this as a description of Church House, Westminster. "The structure and values of clerical culture were all proclaimed in the architecture. That is to say, it was impressive, it was expensive. but it didn't work. Or this, a description of a retreat house and kind of therapy centre run by the parish where Theodora has just begun her work as a deaconess. The retreat house meant in effect that it sheltered a shifting population of people whose needs were unassuageable. Or this very barbed comment about senior clergy. She'd seen enough senior clergy of the Church of England to know that they were men whose talents entitled them to be humble. They leapt to give a lead or speak for the church on topics for which they had no mandate and about which they knew no more than the average layman. They mistook opportunity for authority. Oh, we go, ouch, ouch, because there's a lot of truth in that. Well, if that's all a bit acerbic, through the voice of Theodora and a vicar who is much admired, she writes this: worship, says this of the vicar, worship, the offering of the sacraments, and the example of the spiritual, prayerful life was his aim. He saw the church as giving entry to a supernatural reality of supreme value, not as patching this world's politics or social services. They prayed, she and Geoffrey the vicar, from a deep sense of England, whose people had a right to their prayers. They laboured towards their shared ends by visiting, by being flexible in the formal worship they offered, and were assiduous in nurturing local networks. Prison visiting, hospital visiting, bereavement visiting, school visiting filled their days. And so for her part, Theodora knew from this vicar what a well-run parish should look like. It was the small local good which lay to hand, rather than the large universal good which was beyond reach. The small local good was her goal. Love that. Love that. That's what your George Herbert Aitken did. It was not about changing England. It was about enriching the life of Haslemere. Wonderful. Well, you'll not be surprised if Theodora eventually solves the crime, and she wraps the book up with a statement about the true purpose of the Church of England. And the vicar Geoffrey is speaking. The key is freedom. In the end, political power must fall, for we must embrace freely and without the coercion of fear or desire the life of worship, a life lived towards God. Unless we can freely choose to do this, all is dust and ashes. When I became Bishop of St Albans, I received a lovely letter from a complete stranger inviting me to the Church of St Albans, Holborn. And the letter came from a woman called Kate Charles. This is Kate, and she writes clerical mysteries and detective stories. At one stage, she was the chairman, president, or whatever, of the Crime Writers Association, so she knew her way around that world. And she and her husband Rory soon became very good friends. She used to live in Bedford, now lives in Ludlow. And many of her detective novels are centred either in London or in Norfolk. And Evil Angels Among Them was the book that I went to the launch when I first met Kate. Well, it takes place, the plot, in an imaginary Norfolk parish where a new vicar's taken up the living after the death of a much-loved predecessor. There are two murders intertwined and a subplot about the new vicar's wife receiving obscene phone calls. In this case, the detectives aren't clergy. The hero detective is a London-based lawyer with a private income, and he's got a partner called Lucy Kingsley, whose father was a vicar. So it's no wonder the subtitle is A Clerical Mystery. I'm not going to go on with the plot. It's a bit complex, but it features a potential church warden being murdered, though because the poison used is digitalis, and the house where two other characters live is called Foxglove Cottage, ho ho, you can imagine the plotting is intricate. So it moves this way and that. Sometimes it teeters on the edge of melodrama, but it's a very enjoyable read. It really is. Now, I suppose that what Kate Charles, now living in Shropshire, and one of her Shropshire predecessors, Ellis Peters, are doing, they're playing with the Agatha Christie genre. You have a limited space in which you find evil happening. So in Agatha Christie's case, it might be the murder on the Orient Express or a manor house, as it were, Colonel Mustard in the library and all of that. Then finally, an American author called G.M. Mallier, who I only came across about 6 months ago, she sets her stories in a group of small English parishes where the incumbent is the Reverend Maxon Tudor, a former MI5 agent who brings his observational skills to the twists and turns of village life. He's married to a Wicca follower called Alexa Owen, who runs a New Age shop in one of the villages. The shop is called Goddespell. I think that's so unlikely as to be almost impossible. However, their marriage, whilst apparently very happy, seems to me to be a bit unlikely. They have a son called Owen, but the portrayal of the vicar is astute and careful, and he's hugely pastoral. The book I read was called In Prior's Wood and centred on a series of murders in the village, including the attempted murder of the wife of the lord of the manor. And the plot line is a variant of the David and Bathsheba story. So clergy seem to feature a lot, either directly as detectives or indirectly. Think of Adam Dalgleish, P.D. James' hero. He is not a clergyman, obviously, but he's the son of a vicarage. And Simon Sorrellis, Susan Hill's hero, he's not a vicar either, but has very close associations with the church in the town where he lives. Now, why all this stuff about detective stories? They're hugely popular. I guarantee if you go into Haslemere Library, you'll find there are more books that are in the detective series, shelves than any other kind of fiction. They're very, very popular. Why? Well, I think they have a kind of moral purpose. In other words, evil things happen, but actually evil is eventually conquered and it's resolved. It's a timeless story. Secondly, the detectives themselves are now these days quite flawed characters. So it's a flawed character, possibly a very lonely character like Adam Dalgleish is portrayed, who through their own flawedness can understand other people's flaws and thereby get to grips with the nature of awful occurrences. And I think they're enjoyable, not only because they provide a kind of good versus evil context and you get to enjoy the character of the detective, but they provide a map of the way the world can be. It can be awful and it can be very beautiful. And when those two worlds clash, as they do inevitably in all our lives, who is going to resolve the issue? Now, normally we have to resolve it for ourselves. But the detective characters, I think, are there to offer hints about how resolution may come. So actually, I think detective stories, they're light reading. Nobody's claiming they're King Lear. But I think they have their use, really. They do what Tolkien referred to in his fairy stories. They change the catastrophe from catastrophe and they twist it round so that eventually the good triumphs. Thank you very much for patiently listening to my rambles.